Folks. Welcome to Boston University and the Hurry Institute for Computing. My name is Eric Kolachik. I'm director of the Hurry Institute, and you are here for our Advancing Public Health with Systems Science and Simulation Modeling workshop. Let me tell you just quickly who we are here, and then we're going to move on to describing what we have planned for today. So the Hurry Institute for Computing is dedicated to leading integrated initiatives in research and technology development, targeting a broad set of disciplines at the nexus of the computational and data sciences. We have core strengths in cloud computing, security, data privacy, AI, as well as a network of over 300 plus research affiliates across a vast spectrum of disciplines. The Hurry Institute is positively impacting people everywhere through our research. Today, we're here for a focused research program. The mission of this focused research program is to evolve and advance BU's research in computing and data science around areas of strategic importance and emerging opportunity. The program is in general designed to facilitate research convergence by providing scaffolding, if you will, for groups to coalesce in sustainable ways. The goal is ultimately to accelerate research for future funding and broader impact. They're 1 year in length. They're defined by a single overarching research theme, unifying a handful of interrelated and complementary subthemes or thrusts. So today's FRP is sponsored by a number of entities here and co-led by two individuals I'd like to introduce to you. First, let me thank our co-sponsors. These include BU's Faculty of Computing and Data Sciences, and in particularly their initiative in Computational Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. The BU School of Public Health, the BU Henry H. Goldman School of Dental Medicine, and the BU Center for Innovation in Social Science. And then I very much want to thank Brenda Heaton and Wesley Wildman, not only for their leadership today, but actually for their leadership this entire year. So these symposia typically are the culmination of the full year. Brenda and Wesley have been leading an entire team of faculty throughout the year through a series of workshops, reading groups, teaching efforts, research discussions. It's really been a tremendous effort and greatly appreciated. Let me introduce them to you. So Brenda is an associate professor jointly appointed in the Department of Health Policy and Health Services Research at the Henry M. Goldman School of Dental Medicine and the Department of Epidemiology in the School of Public Health. Her research interests include a focus on the social production of oral health with an overall goal of addressing the complex mechanisms responsible for the emergence of oral health disparities. She's an active member of the Behavioral Epidemiology and Health Services Research Scientific Group of the International Association for Dental Research. And she's currently completing a 3-year term as an elected member of the Board of Directors for the American Association for Dental, Oral, and Craniofacial Research. Wesley is a professor at the Boston University School of Theology, founding member of the Faculty of Computing and Data Sciences, and convener of the Religion and Science doctoral program here in Boston University's Graduate School. He is executive director of the Center for Mind and Culture. He's founding co-director of the Institute for Bicultural Study of Religion and founding co-editor of the journal Religion, Brain, and Behavior, published by Taylor and Francis. His academic work is focused on interpreting religion and building theories of religious beliefs, behaviors, and experiences that acknowledge value in long-standing traditions while attempting to remain intellectually viable in light of the biological, cognitive, evolutionary, physical, and social sciences. So it's my pleasure to turn this over to Brenda and Wesley, and I know we look forward to a fantastic day.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks everybody for being here. Just a little bit about our focused research program. It's called Simulation Modeling for Population Health. And the goal of this program has really been to foster a multidisciplinary environment of faculty that have interests in the application of simulation modeling to population health research and the development of methods that are used to design, build, validate, and ethically evaluate such models. And it's been a really exciting year, as Eric mentioned. It's been made possible by our larger community of faculty members. If you want to go to the next slide. We have a number of individuals from across the campuses at Boston University who have been participating in this effort, and I want to thank them for their time and their engagement, a number of whom you will see today helping to moderate some of these sessions. It includes folks from medicine, public health, epidemiology, statistics, and engineering, as well as sociology. We divided our work and our efforts into three main research thrusts or research groups. We're interested in advancing the modeling of complex human behaviors and behavioral processes. Also looking at how to model system dynamics, spatial context, and really thinking about the impact of interventions on population health that can be tested in a modeling and simulation environment. And then finally, how the simulation modeling and system sciences tools can be used to be able to engage in causal inference. And we had a great workshop on that earlier in April, and the links to these workshops and recordings of them can be made available, and you can access those. I'm going to turn the time over to Wesley, who's going to take us through today's program.
Welcome everyone, far and wide. We're beginning with a session on how systems thinking and simulation modeling can reshape public health. Then there's one on teaching old dogs new tricks, retraining the brain to think like a systems modeler. The first session's pretty straightforward. It comes directly out of the focused research program itself. The second one is something we've discovered along the way. There are a lot of people doing research in public health related areas who are serious experts in an array of methods that they use routinely. They win grant funding because they're good at that. They publish lots of papers and so on. And it is possible to feel, even though we're serious experts, it's possible to feel a little intimidated by new methods. So we've discovered over and over again that people actually want a little bit of help trying to understand how to think a little bit differently, how to integrate new methods into their portfolio. That's what that second session's about. At lunchtime, there are some breakout sessions that we'll talk about in just a moment. And then finally, session 3 has to do with systems thinking in a linear world, challenges and opportunities, where we're really trying to think as generally and radically as possible about what systems thinking can do in a world that seems almost detached from awareness of the consequences of our own actions. We're not very good at seeing into systems and predicting what's going to happen as a species, but with training, we think we can get better. And session 3 will take us in that direction, and there's some closing remarks. The last half hour or so, we try and think about the whole year journey that we've been on. And the lunchtime session, we've got a couple of breakout sessions. You're going to be able to log in using the Zoom link. The meeting ID and passcode are provided there. There's 2 half hours, and you can move between each of the 2 breakout sessions that is available in each one of those 2 half hours for lunch. Freely jump between them. In the first half hour, there's an introduction to any logic, which is the main option for multimodal computational modeling that involves system dynamics modeling, agent-based modeling, and discrete event simulation. And in parallel, there's another one on how to get started. What is conceptual modeling? And how do you even start thinking about these techniques as a tool for population health research? The second half of lunch, there'll be an introduction to NetLogo, which is an agent-based modeling system, the most widely used of the free agent-based modeling systems that are available. It's very famous. And there's a parallel session on collaborating and connecting at BU, understanding that quite a few of the people who are here today are Boston University related and may have a special interest in figuring out how they can work together. Now we're beginning the first session today with a very exciting talk from a keynote speaker. She's going to be identifying the components and hallmarks of systems thinking, explaining to us how it broadens perspectives and expands opportunities in population health research, particularly when facilitated by the application of modelling and simulation methods. I'd like to remind you all that today's session is being recorded and will be posted on the Hariri Institute's YouTube channel this week. And we encourage you to participate and ask questions using the Q&A feature that you'll find in your Zoom window. Questions will be addressed after the talk, and the chat function will be turned off, so everything has to come through the Q&A feature. Annabelle Diez Roux is Dana and David Dornsife Dean and Distinguished University Professor of Epidemiology at Drexel University's Dornsife School of Public Health and Director of the Drexel Urban Health Collaborative. Originally trained as a pediatrician in her native Buenos Aires, she completed public health training at the Johns Hopkins University School of Hygiene and Public Health. Before joining Drexel University, she served on the faculties of Columbia University and the University of Michigan. Dr. Diez Roux is internationally known for her research on the social determinants of population health and the study of how neighborhoods affect health. She has led large NIH and foundation-funded research and training programs in the United States and in collaboration with various institutions in Latin America, and is currently principal investigator of the Wellcome Trust-funded Urban Health in Latin America study. Dr. Diez Roux co-leads the Drexel Faculty Institutional Recruitment for Sustainable Transformation, the so-called FIRST program, funded by NIH in 2021. She has received the Wade Hampton Frost Award for her contributions to public health from the American Public Health Association, the Award for Outstanding Contributions to Epidemiology from the American College of Epidemiology, and the Rothman Career Award from the Society for Epidemiologic Research. She is an elected member of the American Epidemiological Society, the Academy of Behavioral Medicine Research, and the National Academy of Medicine. Dr. Diez Roux has been an active mentor of doctoral students, postdoctoral fellows, and junior faculty from diverse backgrounds. The warmest of welcomes to you, Dr. Diez Roux, and we're greatly looking forward to what you have to say to us today.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you for having me. It looks like this is going to be a fantastic workshop, and it's great to see some old friends and colleagues on the call as well. So
please, we have a few minutes for questions. So there's a question in the Q&A, and others are welcome to enter in questions. But I just wanted to start off with a question on you're a dean of a school of public health, and you mentioned a lot of challenges that we face, and you and others that are going to be talking today have been making calls for system science methods in population health for quite some time now. So how are you really thinking about training the next generation of population health scientists to think in a systems framework? Because it really is a different way of thinking, and it traverses all of the challenges that you've identified. It's the basis for that. So I would be interested in your thoughts on how that needs to kind of shift and how we need to help people reframe their thinking.
yes, thank you, Brenda. That's a great question. I mean, I think it has to be incorporated from the very beginning. You know, from the very beginning, when folks are introduced in their introductory public health courses, when they're introduced to public health and the scope of public health and the kinds of problems that public health deals with, from the very beginning, there needs to be an influx of some of the, you know, the dynamic models, essentially, you know, the concept of feedbacks, the concept of dependency. So that is integrated into how people think about these problems, and then woven in, you know, at various levels according to the different, you know, to whatever level folks are at, or the different kinds of training programs, et cetera. So I think, you know, I think many schools of public health have developed modules and courses. I think there's still more work to do. And I think part of the challenge also is that the faculty that we have, many of them have not been trained in this way. And so I think it may also be a question of transition as some of the folks who are being trained now, become educators themselves. It might be easier.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question from the Q&A and then I'll turn it over to Greg, my co-moderator, for a question as well. So Mariana Torres asks if you can please explain a bit more about the plausibility or proof of principle.
Yeah, that's something that I'm always very interested in. So I can give one example that we worked on many years ago now, but in the neighborhoods effect world, there was a lot of skepticism as to whether neighborhood segregation could generate differences in diet absent, and that it was mostly due to people's preferences, basically, that people's residential location correlated with their preferences, and therefore what they were buying was related to their preferences, not to what was available in their neighborhood. And that stores were responding to that as opposed to differences in availability across neighborhoods. So we developed an agent-based model to examine whether residential segregation itself could generate differences in diet and absent differences in preferences or even price differentials to sort of demonstrate that this was indeed plausible, that this causal mechanism was operating. So I think that's a really interesting use of some of these models too, which is, I don't know that we capitalize on enough to demonstrate that some of the hypotheses we have are indeed plausible. So that's one example.
Thank you. Greg, did you want to chime in? Let's see, is he there? Maybe not.
Yes, hello, and apologies for that. So thank you so much for your presentation. And I was just wondering, Dr. Diez-Roux, how you reckon with what are some inherent challenges in using data from the past to inform predictions of the future?
Yeah, that's always a question. I mean, I think, and it goes beyond that, because I think sometimes what happens, at least what we've experienced as we develop agent-based models, for example, which is the tool that we have used the most, you realize that for some processes and some parameters, you have no data at all, not even data from the past. You have no data at all. And so you have to make assumptions about it, right? And you often, say, well, we're going to make, a few different assumptions, and then we're going to see what the implications are. We're going to sort of test the sensitivity, the robustness of the results to these different assumptions. But, that can multiply a lot when you have lots of parameters for which you're in that situation. And so it becomes a very, complex exercise, and then you end up with a model and you're like, well, and you calibrate it and you're like, well, but is this capturing reality, or is this just mimicking what's there, but it's not? So this is, I think, the data piece, not just data, but the understanding of some of the, the micro mechanisms that you have to put in, right? But I think the only way to fix that is to formulate these models so that we identify those questions, and then we go back to other kinds of approaches to generate the data that we need. So that's why this integration of these different methods is super important, because simulation on its own is not going to solve our problems. We need simulation integrated with enhancing the information that we need to make the simulation model more realistic, more reliable, more valid. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you. And I invite you to respond to any additional questions that are in the Q&A, but I want to transition us to our next slate of speakers. We have an exciting lineup. Our speakers are going to present case studies from particular problem domains in public health in which the application of systems thinking and simulation modeling served to advance scientific discovery and impact beyond conventional approaches. And so I'd like to welcome our presenters. We have Melissa Tracy she's an associate professor in epidemiology and biostatistics from the University of Albany School of Public Health. And she'll be followed by Philippe Giabbanelli, who's also an associate professor, computer science and software engineering at Miami University of Ohio. And then we'll finish with Andrew Brower, who's an assistant research scientist in epidemiology at the University of Michigan. And we're going to take each of their presentations in sequence, and then we will moderate a discussion among the speakers after each of them have given their presentations. So you're welcome to put questions in the chat as they're speaking, but we won't take questions until after all three presentations. And then I'd just like to remind folks that our session is being recorded and it'll be posted to the Hariri Institute's YouTube channel this week. Okay, Melissa, take it away.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you all so much for joining and for allowing me to participate in this session. I'm just gonna cue my slides up here. All righty. So I am going to share with you some work that we've been doing using systems science modeling, specifically agent-based modeling, to address this broad question of how can we best reduce violence and its consequences. We started using agent-based modeling for this research in order to capture the complex system in which experiences of violence occur. And I won't belabor this because I think we all know that exposure to violence is quite a complex issue and there are many different angles from which it can be approached. For example, we know that exposure to violence clusters in space and also in social networks. We can see some examples here. On the left, we have a map of New York City neighborhoods with shading showing different levels of violent crime. And on the right, we have a social network of folks that are high risk of being involved in violence. We also know that experiences of violence are patterned by sociodemographic characteristics like age. So those are all things that we want to be able to capture when we're trying to address this question of how best to reduce violence. At the same time, we know that there are complex interrelations between violence, mental health, and substance use. So for example, as shown in this figure here, in several studies, individuals who experienced assaultive violence had the highest risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder compared to individuals who had experienced other types of traumatic events. And we know that substance use may also play a direct role in experiences of violence, for example, with alcohol-related violence, and may also be a response to traumatic exposure. So we need to be able to capture the interrelations between these domains. In addition, we know that it's important to take a life course approach to this question. For example, exposure to violence in childhood, including both community and family violence, can have lasting effects on biological responses to stress and other behaviors throughout the life course, and even across generations. So obviously we're working with a very complex system, and as Anna alluded to in her presentation, really need to think about methods to try to address and account for this complexity. So I'm specifically going to share how applying agent-based modeling to this question has advanced our knowledge about the occurrence of violence in 3 specific ways that very much reinforces some of the points that Anna made in her talk. It has allowed us to clarify what we know and what we don't know. It requires interdisciplinary collaboration, and it has provided insight into potential intervention strategies. And I'm going to briefly demonstrate each of these 3 points using some examples from an agent-based model based on a 5% sample of the New York City adult population. So agents in this model represented adult residents of New York City and had sociodemographic characteristics like age, sex, race, ethnicity, and education, representative of the adult New York City population. And they could experience violent victimization, participate in violent offending, and witness violence. And they could also develop violence-related post-traumatic stress disorder as the model runs, with probabilities of different behaviors based on a number of administrative and survey data sources as we were developing this model. So I'm not going to go into super detail because I want to be able to kind of take this broader view of what we've learned from this modeling. But we have several publications from this model, and I'm happy to take additional questions about the details of the model as well. So the central components of this model are the agents themselves to represent individuals. And these agents were embedded in neighborhoods designed to reflect neighborhoods in New York City. And they were also embedded in social networks to incorporate peer influences and the transmission of the risks for violence. So as you've already heard, and as you'll hear from several speakers throughout the day today, we start our agent-based modeling process by developing a conceptual diagram of the key components or entities of the model, the key characteristics and behaviors that need to be represented for each of these components, and how they're related to each other, including over time. And as Anna mentioned, the process of creating this diagram and discussing what are the most important features that, of this complex system that absolutely have to be represented in this model to address this question. What can be left out? What should the arrows look like? When are they bidirectional? When are they not? What data do we have to translate this diagram into model code versus what assumptions are we making? How do we test the robustness of our results to those assumptions? All of those kinds of questions are really hashed out during this process of developing this model. So it's a really critical part of the agent-based modeling process that really helps clarify the team's thinking and identifies gaps in our knowledge. So it's a really great way to get started and really can generate a lot of insight just at this point alone. And as our models become more complex and we add new components and new behaviors in order to test new research questions, as in this example where we've added drinking and alcohol-related violence specifically, we have to revisit this whole process and make sure that the decisions that we might have made in the previous version of the model still hold. How do we need to change our arrows now that we have these new components added? And as we move towards incorporating even more complexity, as in this example, where we're also incorporating not just community violence, but also family violence, and really trying to break down relationships between victims and offenders, and also take a life course approach so we can capture dynamics across generations and across an individual's lifespan from childhood through adulthood. This raises a lot more questions about the evidence that we have and how much we want to rely on data versus theory, and thinking about how different mechanisms can be incorporated and explored in our model. And I think this last conceptual diagram really highlights another point that Anna also already touched on, which is the importance of having an interdisciplinary team in place for all stages of model development, implementation, and interpretation. So when it comes to violence, specifically, they're kind of in two different streams of system science research, one coming from criminology, sometimes referred to as computational criminology, and one coming from public health. And I think it's really important that we try to integrate those perspectives when we're going through this process of developing a model, as we can certainly learn a lot from each other and the way that we go about developing these models. We also need to incorporate expertise from, for example, sociology to account for social networks, residential mobility and segregation and their impacts and patterns, and also demographic trends and how that might need to play out if you're trying to incorporate a long time span in your model. We also want to rely on our colleagues in psychology and behavioral science to be able to incorporate biological and behavioral mechanisms in our models and think about different ramifications of exposure to violence across the life course in those domains, as well as implementation science and public policy. As we're designing hypothetical strategies to test in our models, ideally we want them to be able to inform intervention and policy development. So make sure that we're going about that in a way that makes the most sense. And of course, obviously we need expertise in system science and modeling to ensure that we're following best practices as we translate our ideas into code. And I also want to highlight the importance of taking a community engaged approach to model development, including using things like participatory group model building processes where stakeholders from multiple domains, not just academics with different kinds of expertise, but folks with lived experience, folks from community organizations, government agencies, et cetera, are all at the table when this model is being developed so that their input is reflected in the model and the model can be maximally useful to folks. And this is an approach that has been taken with respect to community violence, as shown in this illustration from a group model building approach to understand factors affecting youth violence in Boston. Okay, so the last point that I wanted to touch on with some examples is using an agent-based model as a virtual laboratory to compare different intervention strategies to reduce community violence. And so some of the questions that we have tried to address interventions that we've tried to simulate in our agent-based model have included looking at criminal justice versus public health-based approaches to violence prevention, strategies to reduce the mental health consequences of violence, and strategies to reduce alcohol-related violence specifically. And the really nice thing about using a simulation approach like agent-based modeling is that you can specifically explore different intervention domains and dimensions when you're simulating these interventions. So in every experimental scenario, you can vary not just whether the intervention is present or not, but the intervention dosage, the duration, the timing, who's being targeted to receive the intervention, the degree of intervention fidelity, and then obviously different combinations of interventions. And exploring different intervention scenarios using agent-based modeling has led to several insights, specifically with respect to preventing or reducing violence and its consequences. So I'll show some brief examples over the next couple slides. In one of our first papers with this model, we investigated the effects of a community level intervention, specifically increasing collective efficacy on the prevalence of violent victimization using both a universal approach where all neighborhoods in New York City receive the intervention versus a targeted approach where only the highest violence neighborhoods receive the intervention. And we found, as you can see on this graph here, which shows the average annual percent of violent victimization in the model, that violence was reduced more under the universal intervention than under the targeted intervention. And the reductions were greater as sort of the dosage of intervention increased. However, we also noticed that the Black-white disparities in violent victimization remained under both interventions. And so we wanted to be able to explore that a little bit more. So we were able to use the agent-based model to explore the effects of the environment on intervention effectiveness for Black versus white populations in New York City. And specifically, we found that when the environment was segregated by race and income, similar to the actual residential segregation across New York City neighborhoods, there were larger decreases in violent victimization associated with the collective efficacy intervention for the white population. So the benefits of the intervention were accruing to the white population rather than the Black population, which had higher rates of violent victimization. So we were able to further illustrate the impact of residential segregation by creating an artificial environment where individual agents were randomly assigned to locations in the environment to remove the effects of segregation by race and income. And under those conditions, the benefits of the intervention accrue just about equally to everyone, and Black-white disparities in violent victimization were reduced. So this really helped to demonstrate kind of some of these structural environmental constraints on intervention effectiveness and how those need to be considered and their impacts kind of anticipated. An additional insight that has emerged from several agent-based modeling studies of violence interventions has been the importance of combining multiple interventions simultaneously to have greater effects with less resources and in less time. So this figure shows the impact of increasing access to mental health treatment on the annual prevalence of violent victimization in the white bars, as well as the annual prevalence of violence-related PTSD in the Black bars. And as you can see, very large increases in access to effective mental health treatment would be needed over a 30-year period to see any real movement in these population estimates. So really not very feasible intervention effects that we're seeing here. However, we found that you could see similar effects by combining smaller increases in access to mental health treatment with primary prevention of community violence in a much smaller time frame. And in this example, to be honest, neither approach was really very effective at reducing violence or violence-related PTSD. So it also just kind of further highlighted how important it is to take a really comprehensive approach that tackles these issues from multiple angles simultaneously. Okay, and my last example also illustrates the value of agent-based modeling for identifying and exploring potential unintended consequences of interventions. So in this version of the model, we were interested in reducing alcohol-related violence, both fatal and non-fatal. And we explored several different strategies, including alcohol taxation and closing alcohol outlets in neighborhoods with high outlet density, or specifically targeting outlets with a history of violence to be closed. So we found that closing alcohol outlets had no impact on alcohol-related violence. And this figure shows the rates of alcohol-related homicide under different intervention scenarios. So the first bar is for the no intervention, and then we have these different intervention scenarios closing outlets, either in areas with high outlet density or that had already experienced a history of violence around the outlet. And we really see that there's no change in alcohol-related homicide under any of these interventions. However, we did see an impact on drinking behaviors under these interventions. Specifically, light or moderate drinking was reduced in the model when outlets were closed. However, in some scenarios, heavy drinking actually increased compared to the no intervention scenario when outlets were closed. And it's a small increase, but it could have some implications kind of on a population scale. And this was really because many individuals who were already predisposed to heavy drinking, once outlets were closed, started to cluster at a smaller number of outlets and really reinforced each other's heavy drinking behaviors. So this was a helpful way of using these modeling approaches to help identify potential unintended consequences. So I hope these examples have helped to illustrate the value of agent-based modeling as a complement to other approaches to account for the complex interplay between mental health, substance use, and violence. How developing an agent-based model of community violence has clarified gaps in our understanding of the mechanisms behind the occurrence of violence in different populations. How interdisciplinary community engaged teams are critical to modeling violence and interventions to address violence, and how simulating different intervention scenarios using agent-based modeling has helped to identify optimal combinations of interventions and potential unintended consequences. And as Brenda said, I'm happy to take questions at the end of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. All right, Philippe, you are up.
All right, good morning, and thank you for organizing this. I'm just going to share my screen here. All right, so I'm really happy to be with you all for this workshop. System thinking and modeling in public health is what I do day to day, night to night, all the time. So it's a really exciting topic for me. So this is part of the case study. So following Melissa's case study, mine here is going to be about obesity. I want to emphasize that obesity is more of a guiding example. So I'm going to point out some of the generalities, exemplify them in the case of obesity, but I'd like you to be able to take away some of the more general statements for your own problem, because I realize that we don't all study obesity. Nonetheless, some of the messages that we have are the same. So following what Anna said, not every single problem essentially warrants system thinking. Some problems have characteristics that tell us here is where we should apply system thinking. And I'm going to start with these characteristics. So why do we apply system thinking to obesity, or to something like gun violence, or to alcohol, or to suicide? Obviously, my case is about obesity here. So I'll give you 3 reasons, while noting that if you want more, you can have more. There are many, many reasons why we do system thinking in particular areas. There are excellent papers written on such applications. I'm just going through 3 such reasons here for the sake of time. So to understand why we need to have system thinking, I start with something that is simple. Imagine the world was much simpler than it is, and then we're going to realize why it's not as simple, why it's much more complex, and why we need system thinking. So imagine the world was simpler. So what it would tell you is that most of the problems we faced would have 1 root cause, maybe 2, maybe 3, but just a handful of root causes. You solve this one, so problem is done, gone, the world is beautiful. We know that's not how it works. So if you look at obesity, you can't say, let's just solve stress and obesity is solved. You know, that's not the case. You could always come up with 1 more thing that has to be solved, 1 more. So that thinking of a root cause is really not very helpful in such problems. So stress is not the only thing. You could look at more, you can build like that a much larger model. But the thinking of looking for root causes, whether it be 2, 3, 5 of them, is not really going to advance the problem here. So first, we realize there is no root cause. It's not a very useful way to think about such problems. They are characterized by the lack of a root cause. And structurally, they're even characterized by the fact that it's not just a bunch of chains. Because if what you had every time was a chain, meaning you start with something, you end up with a problem. If you just have a whole set of them, maybe 2, maybe 3, maybe 10,000, you'd be able to give that to a computer program and say, please minimize obesity by telling me how to deal with each one of these here. It would be solvable. It would be a minimization problem, an operational research problem. It'd be easy to solve. So fundamentally, obesity is a complex problem because you don't have one or two or just a handful of root factors. And it's not just a bunch of chains. Structurally, what you have are loops, and they make it a lot harder to deal with the problem. You already had some example in Anna's talk earlier, meaning just a few minutes earlier. Many of the loops you saw there were shorter ones for the sake of time. So A leads to B, B leads back to A. But I want to emphasize that loops can come in all sorts of lengths. Obviously, you have some loops, short feedback loops, A leads to B, leads back to A. But you also can have much longer loops, which are sometimes harder to understand in a system or to even identify in the first place. So in this example here, it's maybe a little bit dated, but it's relatively short and simple. So if somebody is obese, he or she might be subject to weight-based discrimination, which affects their mental well-being. So for instance, they can be depressed. Some antidepressants used to lead to weight gain. So it's a bit of an archetypal example. There are many such loops. So my point is loops are really important. If your system has no loops, you might say, why bother with system thinking? It's a much simpler system. So loops are important. Not every system thinking method is going to be friendly to loops. Some of them are not really meant for that. They can be tweaked. Things can be forced to work for your problem, but it's important, and I'll emphasize that point, to pick the right methods. So that's just one characteristic. Let's move on now to the notion that people are different. I think intuitively, we agree that people are different, but what does that mean? What is different about them? That's where I see commonly some problems in agent-based models and other techniques. Many of these models say that differences are about the characteristics or traits or attributes of individuals, but it's not just that. So to exemplify that, imagine you have created a model, let's say an agent-based model, where your agents have different height, weight, levels of stress, and you might say, oh, I have a heterogeneous population, I'm done, they are different. But I would say they look different. They are not entirely different yet, because what makes people different is the fact that we think or behave differently, not just the fact that we look different. So heterogeneity happens when the behaviors are really different, meaning the rule sets, the way the agents behave, have to be different. So here, two agents could have the same height, weight, and stress, but one of them will react to stress by overeating, another one might react to stress by exercising. So it's important when we create these agent-based models that we don't think of heterogeneity as just being different baseline values, but that we think of different rule sets. Because if all of our agents end up behaving the same way, where is heterogeneity gone, essentially? So that is my second point here. Out of three characteristics, one, that's the presence of loops. The other one, the fact that agents behave are heterogeneous. The third one is going to be about some of the other limitations we typically face, the gradual part. So Anna was telling us about linearity earlier, so I'll be a little bit quicker on that one because it's already been mentioned. So many of the behaviors we tend to be used to, or we wish that we had, are perhaps linear. But in practice, the complex problems are really defined by nonlinearity. So here's a quick example. Imagine I tell you for 1 minute that you should be exercising. So I nag you, I tell you, go exercise, go move. Maybe you do nothing. And if I tell you for 5 minutes, then you get fed up and really you start doing something. So the effect you get at 5 minutes is not 5 times the effect you got at 1 minute. So there might be a sudden change. So there might be nothing for a while, and then suddenly you go beyond the threshold, somebody is really pushed, and then a behavior change is initiated. So it's not a line, it's not linear. What you might have might be a very steep, sudden change in behavior. So these three effects, the presence of loops, heterogeneity, nonlinearity, together tell you you probably should look at system thinking. That would be really the right time to be looking at that. Now, when you look at that, what do? Like, you might be convinced, okay, I need to do something. But for example, there was a question in the chat from Mariana Torres. Do I use system dynamics? Do I use agent-based model? What do I do? That's the next practical question. So we wrote a paper about that. What should you do, essentially? How do you pick the right tool for the job? The answer is in about 20 pages, so I'll try to give you the smaller version for now, for time's sake. But what's important, and I'm going to quote Anna on that, is that methods can constrain our thinking. So rather than starting with a method because we're used to that method and then trying to squeeze the problem to fit into that method, I like it when we can afford some time to look at the characteristics of the problem, the sort of data we have, the questions that the model is supposed to serve, and then we can pick a method. So one of my favorite figures from that specific paper is this one. It's a little bit dense, but between that and 20 pages of a paper, I'm going to go for the figure. So here at several levels, you have some of the alternatives you could take. And then you have what would be next, the next step. There are a few more combinations. Not everything is illustrated into one figure, but at least it gives you the gist of it. So let's say when you have participants, when you have whether they be subject matter experts, community members, stakeholders, so what do you do with them? That's a practical question. What do you do? So there are ways to facilitate. So it could be a group-based model building, it could be one-on-one interviews. You could have role-playing games, which is an indirect way to elicit how people are thinking. You could have various sessions. So you have to choose at that level already. Then eventually you get a conceptual model, and you're going to have more in today's workshops about conceptual model, a lot more than I'm going to tell you in 2 minutes. But you already have choices there as well. So which one of these do you pick? Why, when, which data, which problem, and so on and so forth. So some of the methods that I'll very briefly be discussing are the following ones, because that's what I tend to do, meaning that's what I can exemplify, but other people, other parts of the paper would exemplify other methods. So I typically engage in facilitation, usually one-on-one. I get richer data that way, I find. I create concept maps, which are related to some of the things you're going to see later today. So today we're going to see causal loop diagrams. Nate, for example, has really nice videos on how you do system dynamics, how you think of the causal loop diagrams first. Then I'm going to very, very briefly talk about fuzzy cognitive map and evoke agent-based models. So that would be where I fit. But other people can cover other parts of the diagram. So given your problem, there is somebody out there who can find the right method for it. So let's exemplify a little bit how I proceed and tell you how it works in the case of obesity through the next example. So when I create a model, when I create a map of my system, I need to find people first. So it's a participatory modeling approach. I have participants. Typically for me, they are subject matter experts or SMEs, but they could be community members, they could be other stakeholders. They are human participants. Something that is often missing in participatory modeling studies, and we have papers showing that it's often missing, surveys, is that the selection criteria are not too well defined. So I emphasize that. I understand people have a bit of a convenience sample, shall we say, but there is a limit to that. So the model, if you create it through participatory modeling way, is only as good as the people who participate in that exercise. So if you just pick your friends, well, you get what you get. Maybe they're great friends, but it's not the most repeatable form of science, I would say. So when we have experts, for example, we say, okay, what makes them an expert? What are the criteria? Whether it be experience or educational attainment, what is an expert? What qualifies? So we try to be very clear about how we select them. If they have been nominated, who's the committee? If there is a referral process, how does that work? So the nature of the sample is important. We try to be clear about how we get them. Eventually, you invite them. Some of them will accept, will participate. So you engage in that exercise to build a systems map. That's the qualitative part. A map essentially is a picture of how your system works. So what are the salient constructs? How are they linked? So that's the most system thinking part. It's not yet a simulation model. That would be the quantitative part that comes after. So typically in that process, for example, when I work on obesity or other fields, suicide, various fields, so I usually do one-on-one interviews, typically last an hour. You could engage in group model building also. That's the main alternative here. I found that when you do one-on-one, people aren't feeling judged by their peers. So they'll say whatever it is they believe in because you're there as a neutral facilitator. Whereas when I do group model building, sometimes they don't really feel like saying what they have in mind because they know the person next to them might be judging them or they feel that way. So I do a lot of one-on-one. What I like with the one-on-one is you also get very rich perspectives. So every single interview gives you a map. It gives you the view or the perspective that somebody has about the problem. So you can even compare these perspectives because now you have them in the form of maps. So every interview after we conduct it, again, typically took 1 hour, we're going to turn it into a map. So we go back through the transcript, we look at all of the salient constructs, for example, obesity, stress, depression, body image. These are going to be nodes or circles in our map. And whenever they were talked about together in a sentence, we connect them through edges or directed arrows. Eventually, we do that exercise so we can have a comprehensive map. So all of these individual perspectives are aggregated. The idea is that one individual might not be aware of everything in the system, but if you have enough of them, eventually you're going to reach saturation. So there is a way to determine, to measure when you're done, because you can't just talk to people until you don't feel like anymore. So there is a way to measure, okay, I reached saturation, I have sufficiently characterized my system, here is my map. So at some point we get there. As I told you, if you only get a map, it tells you what is involved. I'm going to have 3 examples right after this on obesity, so you see what questions you can ask, but it is not a simulation model, meaning you cannot ask quantitative numerical questions. So if you want to go there, you need to characterize the system a little further. So you need, for example, to have time delays or rates. Otherwise, you stay at a causal diagram, but you don't go into a simulation model like system dynamics or so. You start needing numbers if you want to make that transition. And then my favorite part, which I will, as I've said, exemplify, is when you use these models. And it's important not to lose track of that, because sometimes we build these models and we end up with a really nice, super complex, super comprehensive model, but we may have lost track of what it was for. So a model has to be adequate. It has to be good enough for the application. The goal is not to replicate reality. Reality is complex, it's hard to manage. We don't want to make a model that is hard to manage. A model has to be sufficient for its purpose. So my favorite part, because I like pictures. So here is a map. It's colorful. It's a bit much to take at once. So let me give you some of the ideas of what we use it for. So in that map of obesity, like I've told you, the circles stand for weight-related factors. So you might see, for example, obesity, weight bias, cultural norms, body image, and the curvy connections tell you that they are related. That first picture is a little bit rainbowy, which I guess works for the month. It's showing you that it's all over the place. So it's an illustration that if you took a disciplinary approach, you would see that it doesn't quite map to a complex system like obesity or something else. So if you think of obesity being a little bit of psychology, a little bit of physiology, a little bit of built environment, well, obviously all these things work together. So it's not like psychology is on one part by itself, the built environment is on another part by itself. All of these things do work together. So if anything, this is an illustration of the fact that we cannot remain within disciplinary boundaries. Collaborations are essential because when you look at the system, all of these things directly interact. Now, if you have a system like this map, you can start asking, what is a more logical grouping? Because a disciplinary grouping is perhaps not the most logical way to go here. So what would make more sense? What would be some themes that you can extract for this map such that you can have a comprehensive prevention package? Because if you want to have a prevention package, you need themes, you need areas of focus, well-defined. So here you can do a thematic analysis or community detection. And what you see when you do that is that you switch to more coherent units, I would say. So you can see that your systems is defined, for example, by the themes of eating disorders, well-being, weight stigma, nutrition. So these give you clear areas of focus. So if you're going to do a policy package, a prevention document, that will help you define clear areas, and then people from different disciplines will have to contribute to each one of them. But this is a bit more solution-oriented than just seeing the disciplines all over the map. Another part that is very useful for interventions is when you figure out what's important. Because if you have a large systems map, so what? What do you do? Where do you start? What do you target? So targets are important. So what you can do would be, for example, network analysis, figure out what is important, what is central. So where are you going to have the most impact for your money? So if you do a cost effectiveness analysis, which of these factors would have the most rippling consequences throughout the system? You want to be able to target something that will lead to change. So structurally, it is useful to figure out what is at the center. Some of these things might not be amenable to a change. Just by looking at them, you'll know it. You can't directly change them. You can't directly target genetics, for example. But some of them will lead to a change and would be a good place, a good lever for a policy action. So that's a little bit of what we do with the maps. Now, we also had discussions earlier about stakeholder engagement, the importance of communication. Maps or system thinking sometimes has a bit of an issue there. So that slide will exemplify what is the problem. So you start with your participants. You have usually a rather transparent process, like an interview, one-on-one, and so on, and you end up with individual maps, say. These tend to be relatively small. Each participant can see the map that he or she built, and they can say, yeah, okay, that's the perspective I had, that's the discussion we just had, that is indeed how I think of the system. So these maps are sufficiently small and clear that they can still be read by people. But when you get onto the larger maps, that can be messy. So earlier, Anna very briefly showed you the foresight obesity map. That's a nice comprehensive map of obesity, but it was a bit misused because people at times in some papers have said, look, it's a plate of spaghetti. It's too large. I don't know what to do with it anymore. So you have that nice transparent process until you get to the very large map. And then that one becomes so large and unwieldy that if you just print the thing, it looks like chaos. So transparency does become a problem there. Communication is limited. So that is something to pay attention to. In our case, we develop software, for example, to help people navigate a map on obesity. We don't just print the thing. It's too large. It's not usable if you print it. It has to be interacted through a software. I will tell you a little bit about how transparency is changing, though, because many of the approaches I've discussed, what you'd find in a paper I cited, are a little bit of a craft. It's a good craft. It's a useful practice. You'll hear more about that through today's workshops. But so far, the emphasis in the field has typically been on a form of craft where you sort of hand make these things. Because of issues like transparency, because we have more data now than we used to, we're moving more towards using machine learning as part of systems thinking and modeling. So there's a bit of a shift in our practices there. Transparency is a big driver of that. So I'll explain briefly what is happening because our practices are changing. I think it's important that we're aware of what's happening there in the field for the next few years at least. So what I'm saying is that participants, as always, lead to a model. They create a model through and with a facilitator. Now, what is new is the use of machine learning to explain, to bring transparency back into that process. Otherwise, if you stop here, then you have a model that might be hard to understand for the participants. So you would not be able to give them back much of what they contributed to themselves. So we want to have something that is explainable. So here's a quick example of what is happening. We take a model, which could be a map, for example, and machine learning will automatically generate textual descriptions, simplified narratives. So that's called natural language generation, or NLG. The input is a model which can be sizable, unwieldy, relatively complex, and the output is something that we are much more comfortable using, which can be used by a large set of people, because not everybody is going to be comfortable dealing with the model or looking at large systems map, but people can read. So generating reports automatically, explaining a system on the fly, on the go, that is what I'm seeing as happening here, big innovation. On that quick example, it's not too fantastic, it's not too impressive perhaps, but if you give larger and larger and more complex models as input, that example is real, that's part of some of the systems we build. You're going to see that machine learning generate text that is pretty smart in a way. So you see some nice transformation of your models. So for example, if you say quality and quantity, it's a bit of a shorthand. Machine learning will rewrite that in a way that's a bit better formed, essentially. Machine learning will realize that you have two things with the same causal impact. They both share a word. I as well rewrite that. So we have really smart machine learning systems out there. They use deep neural networks. It's technical, I can discuss, but maybe it's not the place now. The bottom line is that the input is a model, the output is something that you can explain a bit more. So that way you don't have to do it by hand. It takes away some of the more time-consuming part of the craft and automatizes that process. On a final technical note here is the part about agent-based models, because it's been in discussion earlier. Melissa was telling us about it. I like that demo. I think it really helps looking at all of the case studies. So agent-based models also take a while to build. I think it was Anna who told us that the yield is kind of low compared to other alternatives. It takes forever to build these things. They are worth it, but it is time consuming. So what I'm seeing is also the use of machine learning to automate some of these processes so that we can focus on the key decisions there and leave some of the most annoying parts to the machine. So to be more precise, if you have a large systems map, you have a very large set of rules, but like I've said before, agents have different rules. Not every set of rules applies to every same person. So within this map, some agents will be subject to some rules, some agents will be subject to other rules. Thanks to having a large map, and if you have individual level data, there are now processes, techniques that take these two bits together and automatically create rule sets so that your agents don't only look different, but behave differently. Writing the rule set or writing how agents behave in a multi-agent model is very annoying. It's very, very time consuming. So more automatization there is really time saving for your sanity and for your time as well. So these are some of the changes in practices that I've been seeing. I've been flying some really high level ideas there. I'd be happy to discuss them, obviously, through the Q&A we're going to have after, or by email if you'd like. I'm also going to briefly mention that together with Andrew Page from Western Sydney University, we've put together a special issue. It's due in a few months. Maybe it's too fast for some of the people here, but there are always such special issues anyhow. So we are really interested in system thinking and models in public health. So if you have something that would pertain to that, I'd be happy to discuss it with you as well. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. Andrew, you are up as our final speaker in this session.
Great, thank you so much for having me. So today I will be discussing systems thinking and simulation modeling for tobacco regulatory science. And I'm part of the Center for the Assessment of Tobacco Regulations, which is a center of regulatory science, housed at the University of Michigan and Georgetown University. Today's talk is going to be a little bit different than the last couple of speakers who have focused a lot on sort of big picture conceptual modeling and how that translates into things like agent-based models that take into account lots of large factors. I'm much more of a data-driven sort of a simulation and systems thinking. I like to think about why things have happened the way they have and what happens next. And I think we'll see that through the examples. And what I want to talk today about specifically is how some of this systems thinking and simulation modeling has already begun to impact tobacco regulatory science, and in particular, how that supported a ban on menthol cigarettes. And so just a little bit more than a month ago, the FDA put out a notice of rulemaking proposing to prohibit menthol cigarettes and flavored cigars with the hope that it's going to prevent youth initiation and significantly reduce tobacco-related disease and death. And so menthol, which many of you are probably familiar with, is an organic compound that's associated with minty and cooling sensations. And so for that reason, it's often used in like cough drops. And because it helps soothe the throat and help reduce coughing. And so this the soothing and sort of cough reduction in some ways makes it ideal for cigarette makers because it reduces the harshness of tobacco smoke. Combustible tobacco is inherently irritating. It's hot air, particles in the lungs, and that's an uncomfortable sensation. So menthol is one way in which tobacco companies have introduced additives to their products to make it less unpleasant. But of course, that has the impact of increasing initiation among youth and young adults who are less turned off by the menthol cigarette than by the non-menthol cigarette, because the menthol cigarette is more pleasant to smoke. It also has made it harder for some users to quit. And in particular, menthol has a large health equity issue in that it's disproportionately used by Black Americans who have for a long time been targeted by the tobacco industry with ads, things like the Cool Jazz Festival, these Newport commercials here. And so about 75% of Black Americans who smoke menthol cigarettes. It's also disproportionately used by youth, like I said before, and by women. And I want to highlight one sentence from the FDA's Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. Published modeling studies have estimated a 15% reduction in smoking within 40 years if menthol cigarettes were no longer available in the United States. These studies have estimated that 324 to 650,000 smoking attributable deaths overall, and 92 to 238,000 among African Americans would be avoided over the course of 40 years. And so what I want to highlight here is that the FDA is citing modeling studies in its decision to pursue a prohibition on menthol in cigarettes. And so I want to talk about two sets of studies, one more focused on systems thinking and the other more focused on simulation modeling. The first, we're going to think about how the systems thinking framework can help us understand how menthol impacts transitions between different tobacco products and e-cigarettes. And the second is simulation modeling to understand how proposed regulations, including banning menthol, is going to impact things like smoking prevalence and life years lost. And so let's start with systems thinking for product use transitions. So a lot of our questions about tobacco use behavior relate to transitions between patterns of use. And so that includes things like initiation. So we might ask questions like, what groups have the highest tobacco product initiation rates? And we generally know that that's youth. And e-cigarettes, or sort of more broadly, electronic nicotine delivery systems, are e-cigarettes associated with greater cigarette initiation? So if you're youth and you're experimenting with an e-cigarette, does that mean you're more or less likely to initiate a combustible cigarette? We may also ask questions about cessation. How durable is short-term discontinuation of tobacco use, or is there frequent relapse to continued smoking? Does menthol flavoring in cigarettes reduce cessation rates, and for whom? And product switching. What characteristics or behaviors are associated with successful switching, for example, between cigarettes and e-cigarettes, a harm reduction perspective? And so the sort of system we want to be thinking about is longitudinal behaviors of tobacco use. And so in truth, a person has some true underlying pattern. At some point, they're a never smoker. They initiate at some point, maybe they attempt to quit here and then relapse to becoming a current smoker again. But we don't have access to this truth. We're not observing all people at all times. But we do have longitudinal surveys, even nationally representative ones. But in these, we typically get maybe like once a year, we ask people what their current tobacco product use is. And so here in this individual, we see that they were a never smoker in wave 1 of this survey, a current smoker in waves 2 and 4, and a non-current smoker in waves 3. So we might want to understand what this means in terms of underlying transition rates. And so one way to approach this is with what we call a multi-state transition model. We want to estimate the underlying continuous transition rates. And so we're thinking about it as what's the intensity or pressure to transition. So maybe there's a fairly low pressure to transition from never to current smoker, particularly now when smoking prevalence is at an all-time low. Some pressure to quit from current smokers, but due to that nicotine addiction, there's a fairly high intensity transition back from non-current to current smoker. And when we take the systems thinking to try to estimate these underlying transition rates, it's useful because it makes us be able to make better inferences. And for example, that might mean we can directly compare between different groups. And this is useful because comparisons of probabilities are kind of inherently misleading. So in this very simplified example, we might say that group A is less likely to switch from exclusive cigarette use to exclusive e-cigarette use than group B. But if we look at the whole sort of ecosystem, is this just because group A is more likely to quit than group B is, and that just leaves fewer people to switch from exclusive cigarette to exclusive e-cigarette use? And so kind of the question becomes like, you know, we're seeing this change in e-cigarette use, but is that because of a different part of the system? And so our systems thinking, this multi-state model, is going to take into account multiple competing possibilities when we try to estimate these underlying transition rates. And so in this example, we're going to say that the people have about a 12% probability of remaining in one current state. And that tells us about the overall pressure to transition. So there's a lot of pressure here because 88% of people are transitioning here in about a year, let's say. And if we look at possible future states 1, 2, and 3, we can see that they have different probabilities of being in future states based on previous data. And this tells us about how we're going to divvy up our overall transition hazard. For this fairly straightforward example, we can pretty easily assess specific numbers. But it becomes a lot more difficult when we have a complicated interconnected network of states, as we typically have for tobacco products. And so we can apply this type of systems thinking to compare menthol and non-menthol cigarettes. So, you know, for things like violence and obesity, we're looking at these really large conceptual maps where we have all of these factors, many of which are hard to measure, and that's a really important use of systems thinking. Here, we have kind of a smaller focus where we're just thinking about the different places that one individual could be and what factors impact their likelihood to transition from one to another. So here we're going to look at menthol and non-menthol cigarette use, and also how e-cigarette use complicates that. And so we can think about differential initiation to menthol or non-menthol, differential discontinuation, switching between products, and perhaps adding e-cigarettes with the hope that maybe they're going to quit cigarettes. And so I want to take us to some data here. These are results from the nationally representative study, population assessment of tobacco and health. And this is a heat map of transition probabilities over 1 year. So we read it across a row, and we see that a never user has about a 97% likelihood of remaining a never user, with about a 2% likelihood of having experimented with cigarettes but then stopped, and some other probabilities sort of going down the line. And some things that we're going to just observe here are that cigarette use is persistent, about 80% regardless of menthol or non-menthol, whereas e-cigarette use is a lot more transient. So we see a lot of people dropping their e-cigarette to go to the same state using the product, just without the e-cigarette. If we were to look at the underlying transition rates, which are a little bit harder to visualize here, so we're just going to look at the probabilities, we see that menthol users are no more likely to become dual users. So they're not more likely to pick up an e-cigarette. But overall, menthol users are slightly less likely to discontinue. We don't necessarily see that obviously in these probabilities, but due to the sort of overall ecosystem, the overall potential, we do find a significant decrease for menthol users. However, there are really dramatic differences by race, ethnicity, and by age. So here, upper right, for non-Hispanic Black Americans, really not that much less likely to quit their menthol cigarette than their non-menthol cigarette. And even if they're using non-menthol, they're really likely to switch to menthol. And it's a completely different pattern for non-Hispanic white. And we still see a lot of differences between youth and older adults. And so what we'd like to do is compare these underlying transition rates by sociodemographic factor, by understanding these hazard ratios. And so we can look at hazard ratios, which have to do comparative likelihood of transitioning by this menthol status. And so for something like smoking initiation, we can see that non-Hispanic Black and youth are more likely to initiate menthol, but we don't see that pattern for the non-menthol cigarettes. In terms of smoking discontinuation, I really want to highlight this one point here where Black menthol users are much less likely to discontinue menthol smoking, but we don't see that for non-menthol. Smoking to dual use, again, Black menthol smokers are much less likely to add an e-cigarette, which is means that they maybe have that less of that chance for harm reduction. And in terms of switching, we see that young users in particular are more likely to switch to non-menthol than older users. And that's partly because youth are sort of experimenting and trying a bunch of different products. So we'll take away from this example is that our systems thinking with this multi-state model has demonstrated the sort of differential impact of menthol on youth and on Black Americans in particular. But what do we do with this information? And that brings me to simulation modeling to project the impact of tobacco regulations. And so what are some goals of simulation modeling in this context? So A, we might be interested in forecasting smoking prevalence and health outcomes. And so this is more about the status quo. What will happen if the status quo is maintained? And here we still want to take into account trends because smoking prevalence is decreasing over time, but maybe we want it to decrease faster. So what is it going to be projected to look like in 20, 40 years, just if nothing changes from a policy perspective? But then we want to say, what if policy changes? Let's predict the impact of proposed regulations. So in this context, what will happen if menthol cigarettes are banned? And we can ask what would have happened if we had intervened sooner. So menthol might have been banned in 2009 with other characterizing flavors, could have been banned even earlier. And so we can assess this through counterfactuals in our simulation modeling. So what would have happened if menthol had been banned earlier? So I want to talk us briefly through a couple of examples. So let's start with this last question first. What would have happened if menthol had been banned earlier? This example comes from 2021 Ley and Mendez, an estimation of the harm of menthol cigarettes in the United States from 1980 to 2018. And this is based on one of the formative models in tobacco regulation simulation modeling, the Mendez-Warner model. So this model follows a series of birth cohorts over time, looking at their birth, death, initiation, switching between products, cessation. And this is calibrated to the National Health Interview Survey and uses some other data sets as well. And so looking at what would have happened if menthol had been banned in 1980, here with the little triangles and the dots, we see the calibration of the model to the NHIS data. And then simulate a counterfactual of saying, if menthol weren't allowed, what would likely have happened? And so these circles are that counterfactual. And the authors found that there would have been, the existence of menthol resulted in 23% excess smoking, so about 2.6 percentage points. There was an additional 10 million more smokers over this period, 3 million life years lost, and 380 premature deaths, just because menthol was still on the market between 1980 and 2018. Okay, and so that provides a real justification for saying, menthol has been a public health ill. And so then the next step is what happens if menthol were banned now? And so this comes from paper Levy et al. 2021. I'm an author on this in full disclosure. Public health impact of a US ban on menthol in cigarettes and cigars. And this is based on the smoking and vaping model, which is itself an adaptation of the SimSmoke model, another classic model in tobacco modeling. Here, we used age and sex-specific initiation and cessation rates, and following a birth cohort, again, each over time. Again, calibrated to NIHS, but also using data from the past study we discussed earlier and some others. And so we can see that we're sort of following individuals over time. And the results suggest that a menthol ban implemented around now, by 2060 would reduce smoking prevalence by about 15%, additional almost full percentage point in smoking reduction. Like I said, smoking is sort of already on a decline. How can we make it decline faster, and what are the implications of that? So 11.3 million lives lost, reduction of premature deaths by 380,000. One of the questions that Nate asked earlier was, how do we deal with older data helping us understand what's going to happen in the future? And so that makes me think about how we can calibrate our models to previous data while still thinking about moving trends into the future and also doing sensitivity analysis around possible future changes. And so a couple of big picture takeaways here. We saw that systems thinking in the form of this multi-state transition model helped us to demonstrate that and to really isolate the racial and age-related disparities in menthol cigarette transitions. And we saw that simulation modeling helped us understand both what previous action on menthol would have done and what proposed action is likely to do to enhance public health. And I really want to emphasize that policymakers are increasingly seeing the value of these approaches, and simulation modeling was really explicitly cited by the FDA as a justification for the menthol ban. And so we're really seeing this real-world public health impact of simulation modeling and systems thinking in the context of tobacco regulatory science. I do want to acknowledge everyone at the Center for the Assessment of Tobacco Regulations, and in particular, Rafael Meza, David Levy, and David Mendez, who have been big players in the simulation modeling for tobacco control for a long time. And our work is funded by the NIH and the FDA. And if you're interested in more opportunities in the field, I have a couple of things to suggest / announce. First, there's a short course on simulation modeling for tobacco use, health effects, and policy impacts at the University of Michigan summer session coming this July. There will also be a workshop analyzing trends and transitions for tobacco and public health at Georgetown University in August. Details are forthcoming, but feel free to email me to follow up. And if you're a student and interested in systems thinking in epidemiology and public health more broadly, we have a new MS in computational epidemiology and systems modeling. It's a 2-year program at the University of Michigan, focusing on 4 pillars of epidemiology: mathematical modeling, statistics, and computation. So I will go ahead and stop there.
All right. Well, thank you so much for a really nice set of presentations. I think we all got a lot and learned about the focus of simulation modeling towards the end of reshaping public health and impacting public health. So let me start off with a question for everybody. And Dr. Brower, you spoke about the folks being interested from the end of tobacco control and really pushing sort of a need for systems modeling. But I was wondering what folks have to say about, in say other situations where the pump isn't primed quite as much. How do you think about moving your findings, whether they be sort of actionable effects or null findings, into the policy space? How does that work happen, and what does that look like for you? So any of the panelists can chime in here. And perhaps, you could also maybe speak about some of the challenges also of moving these findings into the policy space.
I mean, just to break the ice, do you want us to go in the same order as we presented? Like it could be Melissa, me, then Andrew? Sure.
Yeah, that would be fine. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Greg, for that question. So I do think this has been somewhat of a challenge, and I think that's where if you have stakeholders engaged in your model development process, you've already created some of those connections and sort of you have someone's ear already that this is something that you're working on, this is coming, you're already looking for their input. We haven't actually done that from the very beginning of the current model that I presented on. And so some of the opportunities that we have had to present some of this work have been coming from, so I'm in Albany, we have a lot of connections with state agencies, there's a lot of interest in, for example, community violence intervention programs right now. And so we do have a little bit of an ear of both the State Division of Criminal Justice Services and the State Department of Health to present some of this work in different forums and at least get it into the minds of people who are working on both funding issues and policy issues at the broader level. But I think those are connections that whether you're doing simulation modeling or anything in public health, we don't always have really strong pathways. And I think this is just another example of that, with an added level of sort of conceptual piece and kind of an abstract thinking piece that isn't always part of what we're presenting in public health. That might be a little extra hurdle, but a lot of the challenges are the same as in any public health question.
Great, thank you so much for that answer.
For me, it really depends on the project, because, for example, right now we have one on suicide. It's with the CDC, and the CDC is not a policy-making agency. So when we work for the CDC, we provide the evidence, much like you put a paper out there, I suppose, but then you cannot say in that paper what the policy implications should be, because it is not the role of the CDC. So we have to be very, very careful in that modeling context. The CDC has its own rule as a federal agency. There are other projects where I do work with policymakers, but then you have different constraints, because, for example, policymakers, they do come and go eventually. There is a political clock, there is what is acceptable by the population, by the policymakers themselves. We've had different challenges. All of this is necessary work, but the constraints depend very much on who you operate with, what's your organizational framework there.
I'll just add a couple of things. I think that connection with policy is really important. And so it's really important to have interdisciplinary teams that are working on this. We can't, it's challenging to both be, a full-time scientist and someone that interacts with policy in an effective way. And so having a large team where people can sort of play these roles is important. The second is that it's important to value the people in policy that appreciate systems modeling and simulation. And I think we're going to see that more and more as we train the next generation of public health people that not only are going to go into science, but are also going to go into policy. And so, and once you sort of begin to develop those relationships, I work not only in tobacco, but also in infectious disease. So here in Michigan, interacted with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services on a hepatitis A outbreak, and that led them to contacting us in COVID, and leading to some more collaborations there that some of my colleagues have furthered. So,
great, thank you so much, and that's nice to hear, Dr. Brouwer, that you have sort of a group of folks that are invested and interested in the sort of policy element to interface with. On a sort of related note, and you can all feel free, if there are questions in the chat, feel free to answer them. But on a related note, I was just wondering, how do you communicate and how do you think about communication of uncertainty within your models? Uncertainty is just a huge factor that's present within these types of models, and it seems that it's important to acknowledge, of course, and at the same time, it seems that it might also cut against the sort of perceived solidity of your results, perhaps to to folks who are not as initiated within the realm of these models. So I was just wondering if any of you had thoughts on that and how to balance those concerns.
I can start. So I agree that uncertainty is important to be really transparent about and address when we're writing up our results from these models. We do a lot of sensitivity analyses to assess how robust our results are to varying assumptions, but a lot of those end up kind of getting relegated to an appendix that may or may not be seen by many people. And so I think it is a challenge how much of that information you can bring, and when the uncertainty actually is part of the story, that's important to tell. I think it's really critical to evaluate that and bring that into the narrative in your actual main paper or presentation, or however you're communicating your findings, so that it doesn't just get lost.
I agree very much with that. I mean, sensitivity analysis is something we do, but it doesn't always get seen. In the case of COVID, we saw that there was a bit of a push toward ensembles of models, so that you don't base your decisions solely on one model, but that way you have more of a global trend, essentially. Because there are so many models, whether it be for COVID, for obesity, for tobacco control. So if you put them together, if you pull them into an ensemble, and then you see what sort of trajectory they build as a collective, that gives you some more strength, essentially, in the actions you're going to take.
Great, thanks for
that. Sorry, remind me of the question.
It was just about how you reckon with uncertainty in your models, and how that may create perhaps a bit of a challenge in also convincing stakeholders of the solidity of your models.
Yeah, absolutely. So often our work gets extracted as a single soundbite, and kind of the best that you can do is to have like a confidence interval on your outcomes. But I completely agree with Melissa and Philippe. You know, you have these sensitivity analyses that get put into appendices, and there's this challenge of, you know, what's too much versus what are people going to actually look at.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like it's a sort of a challenge of kind of threading the needle just right, but also being very transparent. So I think that's all the time we have for this set of questions, but I really want to thank this wonderful set of panelists who showed us a great set of presentations on policy implications and sort of considering policy within the modeling space. Thanks so much. It's certainly something that's near and dear to my heart within simulation modeling. So, and also just another reminder that you can respond to any Q&A that comes in the text directly. And thank you so much.